Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this invitation to be here. It's an honor to deliver the Joseph Smith Lecture. I'm doubly honored to be introduced by my good friend, Tom Griffith, Judge Griffith. I have long admired him. I continue to look up to him. Thank you, Tom. I'm especially grateful to have been invited here by my cousin, Kathleen. She continues to polish and shine the Flake name when the rest of us tarnish it a bit. So thank you for that. Kathleen will understand this better than most. Being a flake from Snowflake has its downfalls. I grew up in Snowflake not knowing that flake was a pejorative term. Nobody made fun of us there. But when Cheryl and I moved to Washington, D.C. after college to do an internship, I'll never forget, I was at a reception. There weren't any name tags, and so we were getting to know some people there, and I was talking to a gentleman who it came up in conversation that I was from Snowflake, but he didn't know my name was Flake. And it turned out he knew somebody from Snowflake. I'm not sure how, but he did. And he was struggling to remember the name. And he went on for a couple of minutes, and finally I thought, well, I'll help him out, and I'll narrow it down a bit. I said, was this person a flake? He said, no, he seemed pretty normal to me. So after that, I've quit asking on that kind of thing. As Judge Griffith noted, I was raised on the F-Bar Ranch in Snowflake, the fifth of 11 children. I didn't appreciate until much later in life the benefits of growing up in that way. In fact, when I heard Ronald Reagan paraphrase Winston Churchill by saying, "There's nothing so good for the inside of a man as the outside of a horse," I concluded that neither of them had been raised on the F-Bar. There was nothing fun or enjoyable about that. In addition to my 10 siblings, I grew up with 69 first cousins on my father's side alone. In case you're wondering, that is how I got elected. I have chosen as my topic today, searching for the better angels of our nature. The reference to better angels, of course, comes from Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address. Lincoln's earnest supplication came when our nation was at war with itself. We have no such calamitous conflict today, gratefully. But perhaps at no time since the war between the states has our nation seemed so divided. In Washington, at least, where we talk endlessly of red states and blue states as if they were competing teams, it seems that the better angels of our nature have been sidelined for good. So how can we summon these better angels? How can we bridge the growing divide? In my own experience, 3 pillars, community, family, and faith, have influenced my approach to politics. Which brings me back to Snowflake, or as Flakes call it, the center of the universe. In the late 1800s, the leadership of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints wanted to ensure that its members were participating in the mainstream political parties. Bishops in many wards or congregations reportedly instructed those seating in the right pews to register as Republicans, and those sitting in the left pews to register as Democrats, or vice versa. In Snowflake, the demarcation was Main Street. Those living on west of Main Street were to register as Republicans. Those living east of Main Street were to register as Democrats. The Flakes were living east of Main Street, and the family dutifully registered as Democrats. That designation largely held until my father's generation. In fact, the family story is that my mother, after dating and marrying my Democrat father, one day said to him, "Dean, your positions and attitudes seem more aligned with the Republican Party." My mother must have been very persuasive. My dad immediately changed his registration to Republican. I don't remember much about political parties growing up. Issues were important, but the issues didn't seem to fall around or along party lines, at least not neatly. I do remember Snowflake's lone barber. He displayed John Birch Society stickers on his truck and on his mirror inside his barbershop. He talked endlessly about getting us out of the United Nations, but he gave the same bad haircut whether you agreed with his politics or not. I learned about civility, a lot about civility from my community. I learned even more from my family. I watched my father serve as a mayor of Snowflake. I worked with my uncle Jake Flake, not a joke, Jake Flake, when he was Arizona's Speaker of the House. I observed my cousin Stan Turley's tenure as President of the State Senate. Each of these public servants were loved and respected by colleagues on both sides of the aisle. My Uncle Jake passed away more than a decade ago after being thrown from his horse, the last of the true cowboy legislators in Arizona. My dad, my mentor, has now been gone for 2 years. He passed on a lot to me. But if there is a partisan gene somewhere in my ancestry, he neither possessed it nor passed it on. Incivility was not in his nature, and for that I am grateful. As for attempting to nurture the better angels of our nature, my mother, Narita, was kind and determined. As early as I can remember being able to read, there was a 3x5 card stuck on our refrigerator. It was permanently stained with vegetable oil, brownie mix, and cookie dough. It read, "Assume the best, look for the good." There were a lot of things stuck to that refrigerator over the years: wedding invitations, ribbons from the county fair, respectable report cards, although those were infrequent, countless sticky notes, reminders of ball games, rodeos, irrigation turns. All of these items came and went, but that card remained. Assume the best, look for the good. It was a gentle reminder from a patient mother who was forever trying to coax the angels out of 11 unruly kids. That phrase, assume the best, look for the good, now adorns the homes of all of my parents' children. I hope that some of it has worn off on all of us. But in addition to community and family, my faith has loomed large in my civic engagement. Over the years, I've been frequently asked what it was like to be a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the United States Senate. I got an early taste of it. Let me explain. I served first 12 years in the House of Representatives, and every 2 years, every member of the House of Representatives stands up together and swears the oath, pledging in unison to uphold and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. In the United States Senate, only a third of the body is elected every 2 years, so it allows for a more personal swearing-in ceremony. Now, 4 senators at a time are ushered to the well of the Senate, where the Vice President of the United States reads the oath of office and we are sworn in. We were invited to bring our own family Bibles to hold with our left hand as our right arm was raised and the rite was performed. As you might have guessed, for my swearing in, I brought a leather-bound set of the standard works, which for members of our church includes the King James Version of the Bible, as well as the Book of Mormon. I wondered what someone in the Senate chamber or somebody watching C-SPAN might think when they saw this unconventional family Bible, but it passed without notice. I returned to my seat in the Senate chamber as the next group of 4 senators came to the well. As one passed, he said, "Senator Flake, I forgot my Bible. Can I borrow yours?" I said, "Sure." As he walked toward the Vice President, I wondered how long it would take before he looked down and realized he was holding something a little bulkier than a traditional Bible. I breathed a sigh of relief when he returned to my desk without incident. He thanked me and handed back the standard works. I then looked across the well of the Senate. There was Majority Leader Harry Reid, a member of my faith. He was wearing a big smile. He slowly walked over and said, "Brother Flake, are you going to inform that good senator that he just swore his oath on the Book of Mormon?" I said, "I'll see how he votes for a while." When the Senate is in session, a weekly prayer breakfast is held. It's attended by roughly 1/3 of the body as schedules permit. Each week, a different senator is asked to talk about his or her faith, to give a sort of faith journey, if you will. The senator who is asked to speak also chooses the hymn that is sung at the beginning of the meeting. A few months into my term, it was my turn to talk about my faith, so I chose the hymn. Let me tell you, to join 30 of my Senate colleagues in singing a very amateur rendition of the Mormon anthem, "I Am a Child of God," is an experience I will never forget. A few months later, another member of my faith was chosen to speak, and he chose the hymn, "Have I Done Any Good in the World Today?" I know what you're thinking. For a bunch of politicians in Washington, that's not an easy question to truthfully answer. But over my 18 years in Congress, I witnessed a steady decline in civility. There are many reasons for this deterioration. The absence of leadership and trust has to be, the absence of friendship and trust has to be at the top of that list. Let me explain a little. In decades past, when members of Congress were elected, they typically moved their families to Washington and lived in the Washington suburbs. The families of Republican members of Congress, Democratic members of Congress, and senators, the kids would attend the same schools, play on the same sports teams. Their families would socialize, entertain, and sometimes worship together. The pull of partisanship during the weekdays was no match for the friendship that was fostered on the weekends. There's an old saying in Washington that you won't question your colleague's motives if you know the names of his or her children. Such familiarity now is all too rare. But it hasn't always been this way. Soon after I arrived in Congress in 2001, I proposed an amendment to lift the American travel ban to Cuba. I always had this strange notion: if you wanted to get rid of the Castro brothers, just make them deal with spring break once or twice. I thought that maybe they'd just wave the white flag after that. In any event, my amendment was opposed most strongly by Republicans, particularly Florida-based Republicans, who thought that we ought to stick to our current policy of isolating Cuba. One Republican opposing my amendment stood during the debate on the House floor and said that my motivation to lift the travel ban stemmed from my desire to drink mojitos on the beach in Cuba. As soon as my Republican colleague said this, a Democrat, David Obey of Wisconsin, who had served more than 40 years in Congress, jumped to the microphone and demanded that those words about me drinking mojitos be stricken from the record. When this happens, debate stops, and the clerk reads from the transcript, and the parliamentarian decides whether the spoken words rise to the level of being defamatory. After the words were removed, I walked over to David Obey. I thanked him for his kind gesture. I asked him why he, a very senior Democrat, who rarely shared my views on appropriation bills, had sought to protect me, a very junior Republican. He responded, Flake, I know you're Mormon. I know you don't drink. I was just protecting your honor." I appreciated that. But sadly, in today's polarized shirts versus skins environment, such inter-party magnanimity is rarely found. If there's a good political fight going on, the inclination is join in, pile on. In his introduction, Judge Griffith mentioned the incident at the State of the Union address with Gabby Giffords. What he didn't mention is that during the President's address, whenever I would help Gabby to her feet, which left me standing, as he mentioned, during the Democratic applause lines, I would get furious texts and emails from angry Republicans demanding to know if I agreed with President Obama. They didn't see what was intended as a kind gesture. They saw someone consorting with the enemy. Much the same happened during the 2016 presidential campaign when Tim Kaine was added to the Democratic ticket. He was the vice presidential nominee. Tim and I had entered the Senate together. We often disagreed on policy, but I knew him to be smart, hardworking, and patriotic. I knew that Tim's son, Nat, was serving our country as a Marine. By way of congratulating Tim on being named to the ticket, I tweeted a playful jab, quote, "Trying to count the ways I hate Tim Kaine. Drawing a blank. Congrats to a good man and a good friend." Once again, unhinged, irrational fury from some on my side of the aisle. At a political gathering not long afterward, I received a scolding from a diehard Republican who said that I was aiding and abetting the enemy. If you can't say anything bad, don't say any. He stopped himself. He caught himself right before he reversed any piece of advice his mother ever gave him. Such is the conditioned response of a shattered politics. On a beautiful June morning just over 2 years ago, I was standing between home plate and first base on a baseball field in Alexandria, Virginia. I had already fielded balls in center field and had taken my batting practice just a few minutes earlier. I was now waiting for the last of my Republican colleagues to take their swings at home plate before heading back to Capitol Hill for the more mundane task of legislating. That's when I heard the first shot ring out. Confused, not knowing exactly what the sound was or where it was coming from, my colleagues and I stood there for a moment until a new volley of gunfire rang out. It was accompanied by our third baseman yelling, "Shooter, shooter." The next 10 minutes were an intense blur as the gunman fired nearly 100 rounds on members of Congress and staff on the field. I remember running and diving into the dugout, cinching another congressman's belt as a tourniquet on the leg of a staff member who had been shot. All the while, more gunfire raged above and around us. When the shooting finally ended, I ran out to the field and used my batting glove to plug the bullet's entry wound into Steve Scalise's hip while we waited for first responders. I then used Steve's phone to call his wife, Jennifer, so that she wouldn't have to find out on television that her husband had been shot. It was an awful call to make. But the most enduring memory I have of that morning came as I turned during the first volley of gunfire toward the dugout, watching bullets dislodge pieces of gravel in front of me. I remember thinking to myself, why? Why us? How can anyone look at a bunch of middle-aged men playing baseball and see the enemy? The gunman who died during the incident had surely been stirred up to anger by the polemics of social media and cable news. Among his belongings was found a piece of paper with a list of Republican targets. The level of hate and vitriol that some Democrats have for Republicans, and many Republicans feel for Democrats, is unhealthy, not just for Republicans and Democrats who harbor these feelings, but for the country as a whole. Just 2 weeks ago, 2 individuals who made substantive threats to me and my family were convicted and sentenced. My wife, Cheryl, who is here tonight, marks the time that we have been out of office by counting the weeks and now months without death threats. A few years ago, the leadership of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints issued a statement titled, "The Mormon Ethic of Civility," which reads in part, "The fabric of civil society tears when stretched thin by its extremities. Civility, then, becomes the measure of our collective and individual character as citizens of a democracy." I have to admit, sometimes I'm concerned that not just the influence, but the verbiage and jargon I hear in church meetings might inadvertently slip into my political dialogue. After delivering a speech on the Senate floor in October of 2017, where I announced that I would not run for re-election in the Senate, a speech in which I decried the lack of civility in politics, the New York Times ran a rather lengthy article under the headline, "Flake's speech bore marks of Mormon faith, not just politics." In it, a professor of religion was quoted saying that the speech reminded him, quote, "of the cadence, tone, and themes that Mormon leaders often use when addressing the church's vast general conference meetings in Salt Lake City, calling on members to refuse to accommodate the immorality of the larger world," unquote. I took that mostly as a compliment. But to continue with the theme of the influence of faith, some of my favorite chapters in the Book of Mormon chronicle the exchange of letters between a mighty military man named Captain Moroni and Pahoran, the governor of the land. In his letter, Moroni excoriates Pahoran for failing to provide for his army, saying, "We desire to know the cause of this exceeding great neglect. Yea, we desire to know the cause of your thoughtless state. Can you think to sit on your thrones in a state of thoughtless stupor?" Now, as an aside, let me just say that in some days in my Senate office, that would have been considered fan mail. But we find out later that Captain Moroni, who was a good and righteous man, was nevertheless acting on bad information. Pahoran had been besieged by his enemies and was in no position to help. Now, Pahoran could have responded in anger. He certainly would have felt justified in returning the vitriolic volley to Moroni. But instead, he listened to his better angels. He answered by saying, "And now in your epistle you have censured me, but it mattereth not, I am not angry, but do rejoice in the greatness of your heart." How different would Washington be if we were to respond in similar fashion? Can you just imagine Mitch McConnell saying to Chuck Schumer, "Chuck, I know you called me a knucklehead, but you meant well. I rejoice in the greatness of your heart. Now let's sit down and pass immigration together." Probably not going to happen, but we can all dream. But as I see it, the only real alternative to having to get along with each other is to be alone, completely alone. Let me tell you, I've tested that alternative, and it's no picnic. 10 years ago, I clicked on Google Earth and located a bunch of small, uninhabited islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Determined to live a strange dream that I've had since childhood, growing up on a dry, dusty ranch, and after reading countless books about sailing adventures gone bad, it's kind of my favorite genre, I decided to maroon myself on one of those remote islands for a week with no food or water, just minimal tools, just to see if I could survive. Just to give you an idea of how alone I was and how lonely I was, after just a few days on the island, I picked up one of the hermit crabs that wandered endlessly through my camp, and with a Sharpie pen that somehow made it into my meager survival kit, I wrote "number 1" on his shell and put him down. I wanted to know if this crab was just doing laps this crab was doing laps around the camp, or if I would see him again. A while later, I picked up another hermit crab and wrote number 2 on his shell. By the end of the week, I had 126 numbered friends. I grew quite fond of number 72, with whom I often shared scraps of coconut. I was not so fond of 47, who pinched my big toe. But it is said that no man is an island. That I can confirm. When I find it difficult to be civil or decent to those around me, and with those with whom I disagree, or when I'm inclined to ignore the better angels of my nature, I think back on the lonely alternative. Now, as an aside, I've returned a few times to those lonely islands. In a bipartisan gesture just a few years ago, New Mexico's Democratic Senator Martin Heinrich and I went back to the Marshall Islands and survived for a week with just a machete between us. I know that's kind of dangerous given the political climate. But we survived. And upon our return to civilization, late-night comic Stephen Colbert quipped, "Flake and Heinrich proved once and for all Republicans and Democrats can get along when death is the only option." The temptation to return verbal fire when we have been publicly insulted is sometimes overwhelming. Just a few months ago, a newly elected Democrat to the House of Representatives publicly used very vulgar language in calling for the president to be removed from office. Since I'd been quite critical of the president's use of similar language in the past, I tweeted out the following, quote, "There should be no place in politics for language like this. Pointing out that the president also speaks crudely is no excuse. We should be better," unquote. Over the next few days, more than 30,000 people commented on my post. The overwhelming sentiment was, if the president speaks this way, then so must we. We have to ask ourselves, where does this escalation lead? What kind of example is set for our kids? As elected officials, how will we govern at all if we treat each other this way? Every so often, we do see a glimmer of hope out there. During a very contentious party line vote during the confirmation process for the Secretary of State nominee last year, one Republican member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Johnny Isaacson, was in Georgia delivering the eulogy for his best friend. Senator Isaacson himself was in failing health. Now, given the narrow margin, Senator Isaacson's absence would have doomed the confirmation until a Democrat, Chris Coons, stepped forward and agreed to pair his vote with the absent Republican colleague, thus allowing the nomination to proceed. Once commonplace, the practice of pairing or voting the opposite way out of deference to an absent colleague has all but disappeared in our hyper-partisan environment. After the vote was called and the confirmation proceeded, the Republican committee chairman, Bob Corker, choked up when he talked to the media about Senator Coons' magnanimous gesture. Oh, and I should mention Senator Martin Heinrich, the Democratic senator from New Mexico with whom I survived a week on the island. In January of this year, Martin asked me, a Republican, to escort him to the well of the Senate chamber when he was sworn in for a second term. We left the machete behind. This fever of rancor and discord, I am convinced, will eventually break. That is my hope, and that is my belief. We will return to ourselves once more, and the sooner the better, because to have a healthy government in this country, we have to have two healthy and functioning political parties, two parties that understand that compromise is essential. Two parties that respect each other in an atmosphere of shared facts and shared values, in comity and in good faith. And who better to help break this fever than those whose faith affirms that we are all children of God, that there is inherent worth in every soul. In an address to BYU's graduating class in 1996 titled Our Fading Civility, the late president of the church, Gordon B. Hinckley, offered this counsel. It is an interesting world that lies ahead of you. In some respects, it is a jungle. It is the absence of civility which creates the jungle. No matter the extent of your education, no matter the degrees which you may add to those you receive today, if that other dimension of which I have spoken is missing, you will have lost that which is most precious. That is the godly quality of reaching out with respect and kindness, with courtesy and appreciation to helping others. I am grateful for the positive influence of community, family, and faith in my life, all of which serve as a constant reminder that I can and should be better tomorrow than I am today. Let me end where I began, with the words of Abraham Lincoln. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break the bonds of affection. The mystic chords of memory will swell again when touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. Thank you for inviting me here to this historic campus. It's an honor to be here. Thank you.